All right, next up, we're going to talk about monsoons. Monsoons are what we call the seasonal prevailing wind in the region of South and Southeast Asia. So, right, the other side of the globe from us. And these monsoonal winds blow in from the southwest between May and September, bringing in a lot of rain. We call that the wet monsoon. And then during October through April, they blow in from the northeast in what we call the dry monsoon. So these monsoons just dump a ridiculous amount of rain. Here in Georgia, we do experience very heavy rainfall. And I thought I knew what a wet storm was, being close to the tropics here in Georgia, until I actually went to the tropics. And let me tell you, it's like being in a high pressure shower. It's just nothing but water coming down. You can see in this image how dense that rainfall is. Right? And of course, with all that rainfall, it causes a lot of floodings. Even cities with really, really good drainage systems, there's so much precipitation that the drainage systems just can't keep up. Water doesn't flow away fast enough. And so during the wet monsoon season, it's very, very common to see things like this where, right, there's just flooding, very common flooding, because the water, more water rains down than has the ability to drain away. Now, what causes this is the shift in the Intertropical Convergence Zone, or the ITCZ, which is a region that encircles the Earth near the equator, and it's where the trade winds from the northern and southern hemispheres come together. So if you look at a satellite image of Earth at any given time, you can typically see a very distinct line of clouds near the equator. Right? That's where the trade winds meet, pushing that warm, wet air at the equator. And even though this ITCZ sits near the equator, it's not always on the equator. It does wobble a little bit depending on the relative strength of the northern and southern trade winds. Right? So during the summer, the ITCZ will actually be pushed northward up into India. And this creates a lot of rain. So we get this wet summer monsoon in Southeastern Asia. And then during the winter, and these are in quotation marks here, summer and winter, because it's near the equator, right? So there's not a winter in terms of snow and ice. It's just what the season that we would call winter. But during the winter, that's their dry monsoon period. And that's because the ITCZ gets pushed back towards the equator, bringing that rain away from Southeast Asia and causing a dry period. Right? So the movement of the ITCZ is what causes the wet summer monsoon and the dry winter monsoon. And even though here we think of having 4 seasons, right? Summer, spring, winter, fall, there they think of having 2 seasons, the wet season and the dry season. So the global monsoon, aggregated over all of these monsoon systems, we think is going to strengthen in the 21st century with an increase in both its area and intensity, right? Again, this is a theme we're seeing over and over again, is just an amplification of the water cycle. So when it's wet, it's wetter. When it's dry, it's drier. We think the wet monsoon season is likely to come earlier and retreat later. That means just an overall lengthening of the monsoon season in many regions. And you can imagine if the modern wet monsoon is already causing frequent flooding that people have to deal with, right? Have to plan their crops around, have to plan their travel around, have to plan their infrastructure around. This is going to be even more intense and has already begun to disrupt agriculture and disrupt economies, right? That depend on a very reliable seasonal cycle when the wet season is just getting longer and stronger. So in this graph, you can see all of these different climate models that look at different variables being the area, the intensity, the amount of precipitation, and the duration. And you can see that every single one of these variables is increasing through time due to climate change.